everybody. Reporting to you again from the Glamour City, Hollywood.
And we know that the UN has said that between 40 and 70% of the emissions reduction we need to achieve by 2050 will come from changing lifestyles and behaviors. So turning down the tap is a really important part of getting there. But also, at this point, we're not going to get to our climate targets without also opening up the drain or removing carbon from the atmosphere that's already there. And that's why we do sell carbon offsets. So if folks want to go above and beyond what they can reduce, we found that the average person on Commons has been able to lower their emissions by about 20% a year. And that's just through spending differently. But about half of that is coming from that spending differently or behavior change, and about half of that is coming from offsetting.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today, I'm joined by Sanchali Pal, founder and CEO of Commons. Welcome to the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So my understanding is during your MBA at Harvard, you started to want to look for an app that maybe helped track food consumption and how that tied into the food choices and the impact of climate change. And when you realized that there wasn't an app that did exactly that, that's when you started Joro, that used credit card statements as a first data input to estimate carbon footprints. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, actually, when I started business school, I had been tracking my carbon footprint in an Excel spreadsheet for 6 years already. And through tracking my carbon footprint, I found that there were choices in my life that I could make that actually meaningfully reduced my carbon footprint and were pretty accessible to me. For instance, I cut my meat consumption from 12 meals a week to 1 meal a week. I didn't go fully vegetarian, but I did have an impact like taking half a car off the road every year from that one action. And so when I got to business school, I was starting to think about, how do I automate this? There must be other choices in my life too that I could make that would lower my emissions, but there's no good tool for figuring out how to do that. So I launched this company to make it easy for people to make spending choices that were lower carbon and hopefully better for them as well.
So I think one of the challenges that we have, and I'm being very, very kind of transparent, is that at least in the segment of the population that care about climate action, is that they are very thoughtful about the kind of purchases that they make. They'll upcycle, recycle, and certainly try to look for local produce, ideally organic fruits that are more plant-based, let's say. But at the same time, the reality is we as consumers, we're very complex and we have multiple archetypes. So even though in one area we may be actually being very thoughtful about it, we're also booking flights to Bali, Indonesia, and basically contributing to CO2 on a significant level with their airline travel, for instance. Or maybe we're going to the Burning Man and having to bring all our own diesel and energy power generators to power this thing in the middle of the desert. So how do we reconcile the fact that all different aspects of our lives maybe not so clean?
The reality is, if we spend money, we're making climate choices. Every consumption choice we make, whether it's food or a new t-shirt or Netflix or a flight to Indonesia, has a carbon footprint associated with it because it requires energy and resources to produce. But it's impossible for us to live a zero carbon life today because the society we live in relies on fossil fuels. What's interesting, I think, is that our spending data is the best predictor of our emissions. The way that we spend money is a great data input to understand where basically the emissions map of our lives. To your point, flights, food, all of those things are things that we generally now in today's day and age buy on our credit or debit cards. And not everyone has the same appetite for change. Some people might be willing to change their diet. Other people might be willing to change the way they travel. Some people might be interested in lowering the emissions from their home energy and also saving money that way. So everyone has different choices they're willing to make, and that's why I think the idea of sort of real-time carbon data is really important and interesting. It's a metric we don't have easy access to today, the way that we have access to cost. And for different folks, they might choose to spend a lot of money on a new car, but not spend a lot of money on new clothes. Some people might choose to spend a lot of carbon on a trip, but not spend a lot of carbon on their diet. So everyone has different trade-offs to make, and that's why having access to carbon information as part of our decision making can be really helpful.
So we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of commons, and I think that at the heart of it, it's really about behavioral change and habit forming. And I wonder, and again, I'm not asking the answer for my question right now, but maybe later on, is that I wonder if the algorithms, the way it's structured, really focuses on guilt versus, let's say, positive reinforcement for new habit formation. Again, I'm going to pause to defer that. Now, let's talk a little bit about how Joro evolved into Commons, and now you're able to basically not only track what people are eating, but you're able to track everything that they're buying, almost like a mint of carbon tracking. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how it has evolved over the years.
Yeah, we relaunched Joro as Commons now. So now the Commons app is available on iOS and Android. And Commons is really just the sort of new iteration of Joro. It relies less on just carbon tracking, the way that our original product was really, it looked like a budgeting app, but for carbon. The new product is kind of, to your point you were talking about before, focused more on what you can do about it. It's focused more on the positive side of things, what types of actions you can take. And that includes personalized recommendations and push notifications based on your spending for ideas of brands you might be interested in, or the types of products you might be interested in to live a lower carbon life. And it also includes more guidance on if you want to, make your laundry routine lower carbon, or you want to green your bank account, there's more step-by-step guidance around the more practical things you can do on the action side of things, in addition to the carbon tracking. And also more recently, we've introduced guidance at the company level, because all of us need to buy things, whether it's detergent or, a new t-shirt. And if you can buy those things from a company that's lower carbon, that can be better for you and better for the earth. So we actually also are now providing company level guidance on how to live more sustainably.
Okay, we're going to dig into that a little bit later on. Now, one of the things you referenced is the Harvard Business Review article that reported that people just aren't that motivated to address climate change. And I wonder why that's the case. And I believe you referenced two things. One is the fact that it's about long term and thinking in a non-linear fashion. And this notion that somehow climate change disaster is happening somewhere else, but not in my neighborhood. Is that true?
I think it's just human nature. I mean, we know that more people than ever before care about climate change. 69% of Americans are trying to make more sustainable spending choices in their daily life. They want to. And that's an important change. I think that's a really big shift that's happened over the last 10 years, is now most consumers care about climate, want to make more sustainable spending choices. Now, wanting to make more sustainable spending choices is the first step, but actually making them is a different thing. You need to have them in a way that's convenient. They need to be high quality options, and they need to be affordable options for people. And so that's what we're trying to do, is trying to make, as much as possible, the sustainable choice the easier choice. Wherever possible, pointing people towards a lower carbon alternative at the same price point to what they're already buying, or helping them shift from a similar behavior to another type of behavior, like shopping for clothing, shopping for thrift clothing. It's a relatively similar way of purchasing an item for yourself. And so definitely, I mean, there are challenges associated with actually following through, and people have so many things on their minds in their daily lives. Climate, because it's a longer term issue, can be in the back of folks' minds. But I think today the modern consumer, especially Gen Z and millennials, really believe that this is an important part of their value set and see it as part of their present lives, not just part of the future.
Now, the last year and a half or so has been quite interesting, coming out of COVID and certainly experiencing this incredibly rapid rise in inflation. Now, of course, the monetary policy has been working hard at that. But with that inflation, we've also seen some data where you have new categories, like say plant-based foods and impossible foods and many other categories of that sort, where they were doing pretty well and they were providing options, sustainable choices perhaps. But because of inflation, because of various other factors, and maybe in some cases people even losing their jobs, you were starting to see that they're going back to kind of older habits, and those companies are in more recent months have suffered significantly. So how do we deal with some of the practical kind of macro things that affects people's budgetary constraints?
Something that's interesting that we're seeing in our own data is that certainly while there's certain types of purchases people are cutting back on that are expensive, there's other types of things that people are focusing on that are saving them money and saving them carbon. So those shifts in behavior aren't all negative, I think, for the environment. For sure, people are moving away from more expensive products at the grocery store, but people are actually spending less money on gasoline because the price of gas has gone so much up in the last couple of years. So people are riding public transport more. They're walking and biking more. They're carpooling with friends and family. Those are climate actions as well as cost-saving actions. We saw from our data in the last year too that people are really moving towards thrift shopping in a pretty big way, both for furniture and for clothing, which have really significant climate impacts as well. So I think that there's opportunities, I think at home as well, energy efficiency at home, using less AC and being more mindful of our utility bills. Those are all really great ways to save carbon and save money. And I think it's all right that there are certain products and services that are still new and innovative, like plant-based proteins, that have a little ways to go before they're cost competitive. But there's lots of other really widely available climate tools and solutions in part of our daily life already.
And many of the segments and some of the personas that you guys go after, they're also the ones that prefer to work remotely. So in some ways, many of them have chosen to move away from city centers. And that has huge implications. They don't have to travel on a regular basis. They're working remotely, which means they don't need to necessarily have a new wardrobe every season, for instance. So it has huge implications. But again, that's a very small subset of the population. But let me go back to getting back into your system itself, and you have something called carbon intuition, and this notion where you guys are converting the credit card information into estimates of kilograms of CO2e, or a common unit of climate impact for a week, month, or year, ultimately to help people change their behavior. And I wonder, does that one-on-one correlation make things much more tangible for people? And what are some evidence of that?
Yeah, I mean, carbon, like dollars, is embedded in every choice we make. We just don't see it. And consumers don't have access to that information right now. However, building a carbon intuition is very important to being able to manage carbon. And as we progress farther and farther towards 2050, it's going to become more and more important that we have a carbon intuition. Right now, we apply something like, say a calorie intuition when we're building our diet. Maybe we'll eat a burger for lunch, but we're not going to eat a burger for dinner. We're not going to eat a salad for every meal necessarily. Some people might, but people have a sense of what balance looks like, an intuition for what balance looks like. And with carbon, we don't have that yet. So what we're trying to do is help give people the information and the tools they need to build that intuition. My daily commute to and from work is about the same carbon footprint as my lunch I eat when I'm at work. So, maybe if I eat a burger for lunch, maybe I'll try to take public transport to work. There's sort of these kinds of trade-offs that you can also make from a carbon perspective that are not visible to people today. So that's really what we're trying to do with the carbon intuition, to make it easier to include carbon in your decision making. You're not always going to make the low carbon choice, but it can be more accessible to include it in your choices.
And I think that's the key, is that I think when it comes to new behavior formation, it's about giving people choices versus, trying to force people into a square peg. Now, one of the dirty secrets in the industry, of course, we have lots of different guests that come on this platform, is recognizing that even though you have regulation policies to even good intent, is that enterprises and certainly even consumers, including the apps that you have, the reality is carbon tracking is messy, it's difficult, and it's probably wrong. And I wonder, Is that a reasonable statement? Or if it is, how do we start to address from an accuracy perspective?
Yeah, it's really interesting you say that. I completely agree. I always say no carbon footprint is right. There's no perfect carbon footprinting. We're kind of in the early days of carbon accounting, just like, in the 1920s, we were in the early days of financial accounting. And there's still a lot of standardization that needs to happen and data collection in order for companies, governments to be able to report in a standardized way on emissions. However, I think even today's carbon footprinting can give us a relative sense of what's important and what isn't. For instance, the fact that a meal I eat is somewhere between 2 and 15 kgs of CO2. And a car that I drive for a day is somewhere between 5 and 30 kgs of CO2, but a flight I take might be 1,000 kgs of CO2. Those sort of relative differences are the ones that we try to focus on with carbon intuition. But I think it is important that consumers that are going to start to encounter carbon data more and more, maybe you see it now on Google Flights or at Chipotle when you buy something, you're starting to see carbon and data and show up in more places, that consumers take that information with a little bit of a grain of salt, that they know, if one thing is 5 kgs of CO2 and another thing is 5.8 kgs of CO2, I wouldn't sweat that difference too much. I would think more about the orders of magnitude as we're making decisions. When you're making decisions that are single digits kgs of CO2, they matter when you make them repeatedly, like food. It matters because you make those decisions 3 times a day. Something like 1,000 kgs of CO2, the only real opportunities you have to make decisions at that magnitude are things like flights, your bank account, maybe your home energy and installing solar or improving the efficiency significantly by insulating your home. There's a few things that really allow you to make decisions at that order of magnitude. And when you're making those decisions, you should do it really carefully.
Great points. Excellent points. Now, because you are tracking so much data, you're getting a lot of insights. And I wonder if there are other insights that you gain through the usage around how to change people's behavior.
Well, to your point earlier, something we found is that celebrations and positive reinforcement works better than telling people they've done something badly. So when we celebrate folks for making a positive choice, like for instance, shopping at a vegetarian restaurant or shopping at a thrift store, that encourages repeat behavior more than telling someone you have a higher carbon footprint from this purchase you made. The other thing that's been helping is encouraging folks to do something based on a very recent behavior. Because we do have spending data, we can do things in relatively real time. So when we give people feedback on something they've just done, they're much more likely to engage. We've also found that based on spending data, we're able to help folks see what other people like them are doing, which is the kind of information they're really interested in. So if we can say other people like you are looking at companies like this or are shopping at lower carbon companies like this. For instance, REI is a climate neutral company that many folks in our community are choosing to shop from over North Face. And so it might be interesting to someone to learn, oh, okay, people like me are shopping at REI. And maybe I should consider that next time I need to make a camping purchase or an outdoor and hiking purchase. So those kinds of insights are performing quite well overall.
I'm glad that you bring that up because I think some of the Gen Zs that's grown up during the TikTok era, they very much think in a tribal fashion. And I say tribal in the sense it's global context, but it's very much following trends. And if they're doing it, I want to do it too. Down to make up to the way they dress and how they live their life. So that's really interesting. Now, from a system algorithm, I wonder because you mentioned personalization and recommendations, how do you go about helping them to switch to that more sustainable brand? How does it exactly work? And I'm curious, is this ad supported? Is this monetization in order to switch to brands? And is this effectively a sponsor type of a recommendation?
For now, we're still quite early. We've only introduced company level recommendations about a month ago, but it's been really interesting to see how it's starting to change people's behavior already. Right now, what we're able to do is recommend folks sustainable brands based on purchases they've made or purchases they're likely to make based on their own spending habits. What we're starting to do also is introduce some financial incentives as well. For instance, right now, if someone decides to switch to clean energy for their utilities via Arcadia, they get $50 off their utility bill when they do it in the Commons app. And we're starting to introduce more financial incentives like that. We hope we can be a platform for people to discover sustainable alternatives to things they need in their life. And actually, starting in mid-September, we're going to, for the first time, be offering rewards, financial rewards to folks for spending more sustainably. So you can actually earn money based on the proportion of your spending that is at sustainable companies, whether that's public transport, thrift stores, farmers markets, or climate neutral brands. So this is all still a bit of an experiment to see how can we best empower consumers to make those choices and send a signal to the companies that are doing the right thing, that consumers really care about this. So I think it's an exciting time to discover it, and we'll see how it goes. But there's no financial payment that a brand can make to us to encourage us to recommend that brand to a customer. Our recommendations are based on whether that brand is measurably lower emissions or not. And only then, once it's measurably lower emissions, sometimes we're approaching companies and asking if they want to offer financial incentives to customers to switch.
So again, I recognize that you guys are somewhat in a early stage of, let's say, piloting some of these features, really understanding where's the opportunities for monetization. But to your point, down the road, some of these switching financial incentives, rebates, discounts are going to have to be paid by somebody. And so it sounds like it could potentially down the road move to a sponsor type of a model within your ecosystem. Is that right?
It's possible, yeah. And I think that what we would be really careful about is making sure that we're making the decisions on which companies can and can't offer financial incentives to customers. For now, we have about 350 brands that are recommended on the platform that have passed our sustainability criteria and are measurably lower carbon than our alternatives. So we'd definitely be open to any of those 350 plus and growing number of brands to offer financial incentives to our customers.
Makes sense. Now, switching gear a little bit, one of the challenges that we have in the climate action circle is that sometimes it's a bit of an echo chamber. We're literally talking to ourselves. The ones that are already engaged and they want to do something about it, they're the ones that's on, like comments as an example. But I wonder, how do we go about reaching those who are still living with the blinders on? And recently, according to Pew Research, many Americans are still very reluctant to phase out fossil fuels, which surprises me, but that's the truth. And then when you slice that data into political lens filters, it becomes very interesting. 80% of Democrats say that climate change is a major threat, while only 23% of Republicans consider climate change a threat at all. And that number for Republicans hasn't changed for over 10 years. Now, if we were to take a flight over to across Atlantic to Europe, 81% of French adults overall and 73% of Germans overall believe that climate change is a major threat. So clearly, within our home country, there's a huge dichotomy. How do we address this fact and the fact that Commons is doing a great job, but it's also engaging people that's already into climate action? But what about the rest of the population that are still very much living in denial?
It is really interesting how political climate change is in the US versus in other countries, where especially, I think all over the world, it's very visible, the effects of the climate crisis, and it's starting to be here as well. It's a reality that much of it has become controversial. And I think what we're trying to do, especially with this shift towards helping people discover sustainable companies, is there are certain things that are not as controversial. Maybe carbon footprinting and offsetting is a relatively niche idea, and that's sort of where we started when we started with Joro. It was just carbon footprinting and then moving into offsetting, which is still a part of our product. But now we're really trying to shift towards helping people just make more sustainable spending choices, or spending choices that are better for them and better for the earth. And that's a little bit less controversial, I think. Most, especially parents, we found are a really big part of our target demographic. Parents or people who are thinking about becoming parents, or people who have just graduated from college and are moving out on their own for the first time. These are people who are starting to make a lot of spending choices. They might be starting to make them for themselves for the first time. Maybe they're starting to think about their children and the planet that they're leaving to their children. And they're worried about, making choices that are going to be good for their kids as well as good for the earth. And so those are the types of people, just regular people making spending choices. What detergent should I buy? What should I feed my kid? How should I save on my energy bill? Those are things that everyone has to think about. And if we can help people make choices that are lower carbon and cost less money, then everyone wins. But I think that there's a lot of work we have to do to sort of expand from just a tool that people see as used for carbon footprinting for the folks who are really climate aware and really interested in that, to something that anyone can use when they're making a spending choice, to make a spending choice that's better for them.
I absolutely, completely agree. For somebody who probably have been living the lifestyle that you're talking about 10, 15 years before it was even a trend, completely agree. And it really is a mindset, and starts with that. I want to ask, as a closing question, comment is for you, outside of Commons, in terms of kind of the business directive and the vision for it, outside of Commons, what we're talking about so far is around more net zero. It's the ability to start to reduce some of our CO2 and other particulates into the atmosphere. But for us to really go beyond that and to try and mitigate the negative implication for the next several centuries over, we have to think about reducing sequestration and actual sinking of CO2. Any thoughts or comments, just generally speaking, about what do you think is needed?
Yeah, I think I really love the bathtub metaphor. We have this bathtub full of carbon emissions. We have to turn down the tap and open the drain. We need to do both at the same time in order to bring the level of carbon back to appropriate levels in our atmosphere. What we can do through our spending choices helps us turn down the tap, or helps us add less CO2 to the atmosphere, which we have to do quickly. And we know that the UN has said that between 40 and 70% of the emissions reduction we need to achieve by 2050 will come from changing lifestyles and behaviors. So turning down the tap is a really important part of getting there. But also, at this point, we're not going to get to our climate targets without also opening up the drain or removing carbon from the atmosphere that's already there. And that's why we do sell carbon offsets. So if folks want to go above and beyond what they can reduce, we found that the average person on Commons has been able to lower their emissions by about 20% a year. And that's just through spending differently. But about half of that is coming from that spending differently or behavior change, and about half of that is coming from offsetting. And we curate and evaluate carbon offset projects for people to buy into, because there's lots of bad offset projects out there. Offsets are very difficult to manage. They're difficult to understand the quality of. So we have a team of experts who actually curates a high quality portfolio of offsets aligned with the way that the most rigorous corporate buyers are putting together portfolios of offsets that maximize impact while minimizing risk. So we think about offsets just like we think about stocks. You hope they go up and to the right, but there's no guarantee. There's risk associated with all of them. So that's why we curate a diversified portfolio of high quality offsets that people can buy into to maximize their impact. And the average person on Commons who subscribes to go climate neutral will pay about $25 a month. But it's based on your own footprint. So if you emit less, you pay less. If you emit more, you pay more. We have people who pay $10, and we have people who pay hundreds of dollars.
Perfect. So on that note, I have been joined by Sanchali Pal, CEO of Commons. Thanks for joining today.
Thank you.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.